The New York Football Giants kicked off OTAs. What do we glean from some of the players out there on the field? Could the West Coast be informing the East Coast star running back's current contract situation? And with a few names out there on the market, should Big Blue and Joe Shane be moving heaven and earth to go all in on the upcoming season? Yes, sir. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, as you know, we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We'll dispense with the idea of being healthy, wealthy, or wise at the moment, and are just excited, Andy, to talk OTAs and some really big narratives that are building up over the course of this summer for Big Blue.
Yeah, it feels like the draft has finally settled in. It feels like these players are no longer representing the colleges that they came from and all the excitement of what they're going to wear around draft time. Feels like you're finally seeing them in pads. All of the OTAs are starting. You really start to get a sense of like what this team is going to look like for the upcoming season.
You better believe it, man. And we're going to talk about some punt returning, exciting stuff, but we know it's a big deal for the Giants. We're also going to talk about some free agents on the market, a potential big trade at wide receiver. We're not trying to gild the lily here. It's Devante Adams. And then also, obviously, the Saquon Barkley situation. But very quickly, we are going to touch on Jalin Hyatt later. Do you give a crap about what number he wears? Because that was a talking point for like 2 straight days around social media. Ugh, I don't like the way it looks on his jersey. He should be wearing a lower number. Give him 13. OBJ is old. All of these things. Like, I just want the dude to play well. And guess what? You fall in love with the number that a player is wearing because of how he performs, not because the number somehow spurred on, his play on the field.
Yeah, I mean, the number thing is pretty silly to me. It's like,
Thank
were
you.
you really that excited about number 13 until Odell Beckham Jr. wore it? Like,
Right.
for
What
me,
the
it's
hefty
it's
lefty
kind
wore
of
13, correct? Like, what are we talking about? It's not like it had this lineage in it until OBJ put it on.
well, yeah, right. Like Amani Toomer wore 81 for the New York Giants. It's like I don't know. It's one of those things where it's like the player makes the number doesn't make
Yes.
the player. I will say, as silly as I think it is, sometimes when we talk about jersey colors or the jersey that they wear with like the like home blues versus
Yeah,
the
yeah.
away whites versus some of the color rush things, I do actually have some strong opinions on the jerseys that they should wear, but the numbers that they wear, not for me.
We'll save the jersey conversation for another day because I don't disagree, but I'll probably go even a layer deeper on the thing that bothers me about jersey combinations, etc. That being the case, first quick tidbit here. We talked about obviously Saquon Barkley, the contract situation. We know that the Giants and Joe Shane have continued to pull away from what at one point was an upwards of, with incentives, $14 million, $14 a year, trying to get a sweetheart deal, $14 million a year for Saquon. But you had Austin Ekler and what's gone on with him out there on the West Coast, and the question about whether or not it informs, if at all, what's going on with Saquon.
Yeah, so very interesting. So today, the Chargers reached a revised agreement for this upcoming season. Austin Eckler is basically making the same 6.125 salary. What they restructured is they put another 1.75 million in incentives for Austin Eckler, so can make up to $8 million this year. They asked the general manager Tom Telesco.
Mhm.
Basically, okay, he asked for a trade a while ago. What was the interest from other teams? Did you have a lot of teams calling? He said, nope. And that's all he left it at, which
Right.
is pretty damning when you think about like what he's saying. He was like, I'm not even entertaining this. We're not trading him. There's no trade interest. No, thank you. What I find fascinating about Austin Eckler is he is the engine that helps that team go, for the LA Chargers. He is multi-threat in terms of being able to run the ball and catch it out of the backfield. Security blanket for Justin Herbert. He's only a year older than Saquon Barkley, Adam. And so he's looking for a new deal. The team said no. He was looking to get traded. They said no. And all he could muster up from, an admitted position of weakness was getting another $1.75 million in incentives that says if he plays well, the team will pay him. What are your thoughts at the top?
Yeah, I mean, we know that it's just what happens with the running back position, right? And if you are a shrewd organization, you're not going to overcommit to players like this, in spite of the fact that he's a guy that has over 3,700 yards in his career, averaging 4.6 yards per carry, those 34 touchdowns. And you mentioned, like, in a time for the Chargers when you have your young quarterback in Herbert and you want to have sustainability there, you'd think, hey, sometimes you're willing to overspend at any position to make sure that you give as many weapons as possible to your quarterback, because coming into the season, the Chargers, they're looking on a deep run, right? They want to be a deep playoff run team, and they did some great things in the draft as well. But it's the position. So, you do right, I guess, by Eckler and saying, hey, there's some incentives you can hit here before you go out the door. But he's not coming back next year. They're going to move on. They're going to get younger at the position. And we know that it's a very replaceable weapon, even though sometimes statistically you get caught up in, wow, look at the number he's putting up. I think a lot of teams say that's a product of our offensive line play, our collective offensive unit, as much as it is about the individual play.
Yeah, what I do find fascinating though is he is only a year older. He has been more productive than Saquon has because he's been healthier. So the
Yep.
statistical numbers look higher, especially in pass catching touchdowns and receiving yards and things like that. But Adam, you're looking at the market. You're looking at guys like Miles Sanders who are 25 years old. You're looking at a guy like Austin Eckler who's only a year older than Saquon Barkley, getting 8 million all in if he performs really well. We
Yep.
talked about, Saquon basically turned down 13-ish million dollars. Some reports are saying it could have been a little more or less during the season. Where do you think this leaves the Giants? Like, Joe Shane is going to point to this and say, this is what the market is dictating with every other contract that has been signed in the last year. We have to throw out the Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon contracts because they were signed a few years ago, and all those teams are trying to get off of those players now. The current market dictates 8 million, 9 million.
Yeah.
Do you feel like Saquon Barkley's negotiation is in its own realm because of what he means to the team? Or do you think, there's going to be a reckoning that's going to happen here?
Yeah, and by the way, over 3,400 in his career yards receiving for Eckler as well, right? So combined over 7,000 yards. He does it in both facets of the game and has 80% catch percentage. So he's that dual threat weapon for them, just like Saquon Barkley is. Listen, from the inside, as a Giants fan, right? You go, you have to, but just think about every other example around the NFL, man. High profile guys walk all the time. Big names you never think would get moved all of the time. And to me, while on the one hand, you could sit here and say he is very important, you don't want to have him represent the same high volume percentage of the offensive production for this team. And that's why you draft a player like Jalin Hyatt. It's why you go out and get Darren Waller, right? It's why you want this to be a more balanced system, when you have Daniel Jones under center. But remember, you also went out and got Eric Gray in the draft. Gary Brightwell, who knows if he's going to make the team or how that's going to look. Remember that they took a young player in Corbin the year before. Like, the world where this one just kind of plays itself out and someone else starts to show a level of production, not at Saquon Barkley levels, but just a level of production that you can squint and you can see a still green other side of the fence beyond Saquon Barkley. And I think organizationally, that's what you're slow playing your way towards, so that the fan base, maybe by the end of this upcoming year, goes, yeah, man, it's been great. But, now the team is good. We're not just a Saquon Barkley based team. We have a lot of weapons. We have a lot of talent. You couldn't say that early in Saquon's career. And frankly, it's a shame, because it's not Saquon's fault. Like, the injuries weren't his fault. The team being awful wasn't his fault. But I think he's going to fall victim to being drafted in an era of New York Football Giants when the team was trash.
Well, last question for you on Saquon Barkley then. If Saquon's representatives come back to Joe Shane tomorrow and say, 4 years, $13 million, we'll sign on the dotted line right now. Like, let's get Saquon Barkley in the building. Do you do it as a Giant fan to wrap up your franchise cornerstone? Or do you look at it as like, it would be GM malpractice to overpay by 30 or 40% when the
Yeah.
market is dictating everything else to these other players?
I mean, listen, you talk about the guaranteed number, right? What does that look like out and out after 2 years, potentially? Sure, right? Like, so I think that's really what it comes down to. Same thing like the Daniel Jones contract. What's the guaranteed money, right? The Giants could still walk away in 2 years at $40 million and and feel fine about that. Maybe they try to line it up that way, where it's, if do we want to just hedge our bets a little bit, that if Daniel Jones didn't work out, we can clean the slate in a lot of positions on this roster. Maybe. Like, I think the Giants would be happy to explore that, but 13 million, man, like Joe Shane has already shown he's not just going to throw the money around based on sentimentality, right? And this isn't his guy. He didn't draft him. We know what he means to the team, but I don't think that Joe Shane can afford to fall prey to the fan base. Can't fall prey to John Mara listening too much to the fans over the years and then making knee-jerk emotional decisions around Eli Manning, around the draft class with Dave Gettleman, and then turning around and having to apologize rightfully for wrongfully listening to and being informed by, right? Like, it's like this weird vicious cycle. I think Joe Shane has gotten the Giants out of that. So you have to be able to move on from it. I listen, I think he plays underneath the contract. I don't think that, the tag, I don't think that the new contract is coming before the season starts.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't see a way that they're going to get a deal done unless Saquon decides to come back hat in hand and say, I'll take your best offer. I want to be on this team long term. Outside of that, you're right. Like, there's just no middle ground. And it wouldn't make sense for anyone to accept anything else.
That's right. OTAs are underway, my friend. And an interesting thing happened in the summer. The New York Football Giants, who once upon a time put out their number one cornerback to get hurt in the return game, have him out there in OTAs returning punts along with rookie Jalin Hyatt. WTF, Andy? Like, what's going on here? It's just OTAs. Maybe it doesn't matter. Just getting some summer rhythm for yourself. But unlike even last year when they still had other options, but maybe one that wasn't trustworthy in Richie James, the Giants have a lot of possibilities in the return game. Are you concerned, disgusted, irritated by the fact that Adoree Jackson is anywhere near the special teams return game?
So I get it. He is an athletic talent. He has returned
Yes.
punts in college and in
Sure
the
has.
pros and can potentially flip a field. I get all of that. But the need for him to be there on defense outweighs any ability that he may have in that punt return game for me.
But what if
And
they
we
get like
saw,
2 more yards on a punt return, Andy?
yeah, yeah, just two more. Just be able to get across the 50 as opposed to the 48-yard
Andrew,
line.
over the course of a season, the Giants' average starting field position off of punts was the 29 or 30-yard line versus the 27-yard line?
Yeah, it's just silly to me. Adam, like, I get it. Also, you can't just look at Adoree Jackson, who's a leader on this team, and say, we're not putting you back there anymore if he really wants to. You almost
Yes.
got to like ease him into the idea that he's never going to be returning punts ever again. So like, you want to do some of these in OTAs where no one's tackling you and you just want to like sit back there and
Right.
play
Right.
left field. Like, sure, go ahead, Adoree. We have all the plans in the world for you. But listen, Jalin Hyatt was also returning punts back there.
Mhm.
That is a very likely guy to be able to get a crack at it. Paris Campbell has returned punts before. There's other wide receivers. I think you even mentioned Jamison Crowder is another guy that has
Yeah.
returned a ton of punts. We are not void of talented people that can return punts now. I don't think out of desperation we need to throw Adoree Jackson back there because we saw what a disaster can look like when things go wrong.
And by the way, like, so I'll make a point here in a second, but a guy like Gary Brightwell, he worked on special teams. Don't know if he's even going to be on this roster. So, you're threading the needle about who you give reps to here, but allow him to prove or disprove if he's worthy of being on the 53-man roster in a specific special teams and deep running back depth role, right? Khalil Pimpleton was on the practice squad last year. You're maybe going to see him get some run there. You mentioned Jamison Crowder's a veteran guy. Darnay Holmes is someone that, like, you can theorize on. He had some run of it last year. If he's going to stick around on this roster now that you filled in that secondary, maybe that's something he can carve out for himself. There are dozens. Dozens is heavy. I could name 7 dudes that should be back there with the opportunity to return punts and make a role for themselves. And even if you think that Adoree Jackson is the clear-cut best option for that role, you still have to set yourself up to say, like, but someone else can prove themselves here and we can move away from it. I don't think that Adoree Jackson is going to return punts. That's the bottom line. So I'll even go to a more maybe surprising statement. I don't think Jalin Hyatt should be returning punts either. Like, in theory, Jalin Hyatt is coming in here with where he was drafted by the New York Football Giants. I understand he's a rookie. He's got to come in here. We haven't really talked about this, but like, he's your 1A wide receiver. Like, he's the most dynamic weapon you're potentially going to have here. We know about Wan'Dale Robinson's second-round pick. We understand where Jalin Hyatt was taken, but where the talent was regarded coming into the draft. you have to look at him as being a key component to what you want to accomplish. Has to learn the system, has to expand the route tree. So this world where, hey, if he's a little bit limited in the route tree combinations he runs early in the season, you maximize the value of the player by putting him in there in special teams and being a dynamic weapon. I get that. But even that should be phased out pretty quickly, because I expect Jalin Hyatt to become an offensive impact player when you have Darren Waller, when you still have Isaiah Hodgins, and you have Darius Slayton. Like, there's going to be this opportunity for Jalin Hyatt, even with a learning curve, to just get the ball in his hands and let him be impact, like let him make plays, let him stretch the field out over the top, right? So I don't expect maybe either one of these guys to be as nearly involved in special teams and punt returning as it may look early in the summer and even early into the season.
Yeah, I can understand your hesitations with Jalin Hyatt. I would remind you that he was the third selection for the Giants, later in the second round, and being able to move up. I
Yeah.
I understand your cautionary tales about why you wouldn't want him doing it. Gone are the days of the number one wide receiver being back there to catch it because he's got the surest hands, or he's
Right.
really good with the football in his hands. Like, there's different people that are specialized to do different jobs. We mentioned Campbell. We mentioned Jamison Crowder if he ends up making the roster. There's a whole host of people that can return punts. I'm not as upset as Hyatt doing it, because I think
No.
it's good to get a rookie involved and get him integrated in the offense. Maybe that's a way that he could get touches early on to
Mm-hmm.
feel like the speed of the NFL. But yes, overall, Adoree Jackson should be nowhere near punt returning. I think we have enough options where we don't have to default to someone like Richie James, in the punt return game where everyone all of a sudden makes it a big issue.
Yeah, and the team is deeper overall. So you think that even when you have injuries, just from a high level, right, that you have the ability to at least sustain yourself across those, as opposed to the last couple of seasons where when one guy went down, it became a real nail in the coffin for that position group over those weeks that that player was going to miss. All right, turning our attention then over to a potential free agent recently released from the New England Patriots. I allow you, Andy, to take the lead on this and whether or not we think there's a fit with Big Blue.
Yeah, Yanni Kajuste is offensive tackle, was drafted by the Patriots in the third round a few years ago. I
Yes,
believe was
sir.
the Big 10 or Big 12 offensive tackle of the year. Guy was a really good prospect coming out of West Virginia, was it? I believe. Yeah, the West Virginia Mountaineers. Drafted 101 overall and just could not stay on the field, Adam. Like, his first 2 years, first he had a quad injury, out for the year. Next, knee injury, out for the year. Then he saw some sparing playing time over the last 2 seasons. And when he's been in, Adam, he's been a decent player for the Patriots. The problem is, they can't rely on him. Injuries have zapped him of any goodwill that he has within the organization. And so a fresh start kind of makes sense for him. He, gets released. His first 2 visits look to be scheduled in the same building with the Jets and the Giants, who both potentially could use some offensive line help. Adam, he's only 27 years old. And, in the limited snaps that he had 197 snaps last season, has 65 Pro Football Focus rating. Is this the type of player the Giants should be kicking the tires on at the tackle position, given the current roster construction?
And that's the answer is in the current roster construction. Matt Pert, Corey Cunningham, Tyree Phillips, Devery Hamilton. Those are the guys. Those are the guys that are competing for the backup, potentially swing tackle spot for the New York Football Giants. If you have confidence in one of them inside the building, great. But I don't think there's anything wrong with bringing in a player like Yandy and saying, hey, if you, even for the simple fact of, you may just let us know that one of these dudes shouldn't be on the roster, right? Let alone whether we think you can be healthy enough, whether you can be that backup swing tackle. We just want, confirmation about the way our roster is constructed and whether or not one of these guys is capable of continuing to develop. Remember, we know Matt Pert is a holdover draft pick. We certainly got excited about him early. It flashed early, by the way, and then did not seem to be able to sustain that and develop. I'd love to see Matt Pert emerge and claim a backup role on this offensive line, but bringing in a guy that obviously has some injury concerns, obviously is a veteran player and may not ultimately end up, be able to command a high price point on the market. Sure, bring him in, let him push some people, and if he gets a role for you, great. If he doesn't, I'm not going to sweat if he ends up signing with the Jets.
Yeah, and also when you think about Matt Parrott, you just mentioned he's one of the names that you think about here. Obviously drafted by a previous regime, started with a 69 Pro Football Focus rating, on 100 something snaps, then went up to 400 snaps. Adam, had a 63 pro football focus rating. So it went down the more that people saw him. And then last year, he obviously was a little bit banged up and injured. Still only had like a 49 pro football focus rating. So things have trended down since year one. It just feels like when you think about the type of prospect he is, drafted by a previous regime. Adam, also the Giants can save just over $1 million if they were to cut Matt Pert. He only has a $200,000 dead cap hit.
Yeah.
That means you could slot in someone like Kajusti like right away if you wanted to, like for like change. So I have no problems if you end up bringing him in to compete and seeing who ends up being a better version of a reliable swing tackle.
Last but not least, my friends, we offer you this little tidbit. Obviously, there are some high profile veterans around the league at the wide receiver position that could be available on the market based on what their current teams are trying to do going forward. Some regime changes, some coaching changes, some just, nuts and bolts, swinging and missing. Things are moving here. We've talked about DeAndre Hopkins before, obviously, with the Cardinals, but now Devante Adams is also surfacing as being someone that the Raiders may be willing to move off of. Frankly, he may be wanting to move off of the Raiders at this point. Where do you stand on the idea of, we'll talk about if it's feasible, but should a player like Devante Adams, with everything that he represents from a talent standpoint, be someone that the Giants should be willing to really go all in on here, knowing that he represents a $14.7 million cap hit in the upcoming season, $25.3 million the following year, and then has 2 more years on his deal that really escalate, but they also have the potential out in 2025?
Oh, tough question. I mean, this seems to come up all the time for Giants fans, Giants Twitter. First, it was DeAndre Hopkins, disgruntled. He doesn't want to be part of a rebuild. Now it's Devante Adams in a similar boat, doesn't want to be part of a rebuild. And it's kind of the same question with the same answer, right? It's like, are we at the moment where we get a number one type wide receiver and we expect to make the playoffs and make a run at the Super Bowl? Like, if this is the move that puts the Giants over the top, then yes, you trade whatever future assets you need to, knowing that you're mortgaging a little bit of the future in order to get that guy to complete the roster. I don't necessarily think that the Giants are there yet as a team and as an organization. I mean, you're talking about Devante Adams is 30. DeAndre Hopkins is 30 years old as well. When you think about where this team is and where their talent is, Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley, all the draft picks that they have are younger. Dexter Lawrence is younger. This is a younger team that is emerging. I just don't know if you sign Devante Adams or you trade for DeAndre Hopkins, give up 2 first-round picks and give him $30 million. If that is the right timeline for this team to win a Super Bowl, that's the tough part for me.
Here's the difference for me, and I'll contrast it just with specifically with DeAndre Hopkins. Injuries, obviously, PEDs, obviously, so some sense of it, and he also wants a new contract, something that at least Devante Adams already has. Now, whether or not you want to be sitting here in a couple of years, because Devante will be 33 and 34 at the back end of this contract, and we know how that is for wide receivers as they get into their 30s. So I think there's a difference to me between these two players just over the last couple of seasons and seeing how things have unfolded for them. That's the one part of it. The other part that I would bring up is when you talk about where this team is, some of the key players, specifically Daniel Jones, right? And now you're bringing in some younger guys underneath Joe Shane. Yes, they are trending younger. But you also have to remember that a guy like Darren Waller, who's on the books through 2026 and will be 34 years old at that point, making just $13.5 million, but still a substantial amount of money there. And then you look inside the active roster right now and remember that you have $18 million as a base salary for Leonard Williams, who's 29 years old. We've talked about Adoree Jackson. He has $11 million right now, 28 years old. So let's bring it back to the top and talking about Saquon Barkley. The world where you get back to the table, and listen, we know the mechanics of it, what do you have to send out, how you make all the room to afford this type of decision. But if you get Saquon Barkley locked in on a 4-year deal, it's effectively 2. And if you manipulate Leonard Williams' money and you can get out from him in a couple of seasons, and you have the out on Daniel Jones in a couple of years, even like Adoree Jackson's not going to be here in a couple of years, probably. All of a sudden, I think like if you are a segment of the fan base that believes this team could potentially compete for this division, maybe they're on the fringe of nipping at the heels of the Eagles. Well, a move like this does all of a sudden dramatically change the dynamic of your team. You be talking about having Devante Adams, Darren Waller, a rookie in Jalin Hyatt, Saquon Barkley in the backfield. I mean, leave Hyatt out of it. Waller, Adams and Barkley, that may be, at least on paper, one of the most dynamic tandems at wide receiver, tight end, and running back in the entirety of the NFL. Are there health concerns around Waller? Sure. Are there production concerns as he gets into his 30s for Devante Adams? Yes. But like, if I want to take a big swing here, knowing that within the next 2 years I can reset all of that, I'm definitely thinking about it. I don't even sniff it for a guy like Hopkins, but I do for Adams because this dude is legit and is going to go down as one of the best wide receivers in the history of the game.
I have a question for you, Adam.
Hit me
Because
with
the more you were saying that, the more I appreciate it. It's like locking the players for the next 3, maybe 4 years, and this is the run. This is the window. Do you know who led the NFL in rushing in 2023? Shot in the dark.
No, I'm not going to. It's not going to be Christian McCaffrey because he got traded late.
So the answer is
It's going to be some no-name
Josh
or like a
Jacobs.
relative.
Josh
There you go.
Jacobs
Oh, yeah, right.
from the Las Vegas Raiders.
Raiders.
And we would argue that we think Saquon Barkley is more dynamic than Josh Jacobs of the Raiders. What we're saying is basically we would be moving the offensive scheme from the Las Vegas Raiders last year with Devante Adams, Darren Waller, and now Saquon Barkley, who's at least comparable to Josh Jacobs. But that team faltered. They basically were thinking about firing their coach. They released their quarterback. Like, it all fell apart for them. And yes, a lot of that has to do with the defensive side of the ball. But it's like, if we bring in Devante Adams, we're basically replicating that grouping there. And for good
but then
or
I
for
throw
worse,
back
that's
at
kind of
you,
what it
which
would
is
look
this
like.
we debate with fans and everybody else. What is your opinion of Daniel Jones relative to Derek Carr, right? Because if you believe in Daniel Jones and his upside, and clearly a more mobile quarterback than Derek Carr, but if you believe in Daniel Jones and his trajectory, then you're looking at it as like we're catching the wave of what that could be and cresting, as opposed to maybe the back end of what's fizzling out there in Vegas, a team that maybe is a little dysfunctional, especially with that head coach.
Yeah, little bit of a mess over there. I just think it's funny. We're like, hey, we just traded for Waller. Let's get Adams. Hey, if Saquon walks, is Josh Jacobs available? We're like, just let's get all the Las Vegas Raider like offensive guys because their defense has been
It's the Las
absolutely
Vegas Raiders
abysmal.
East. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting, man. It's fun. Again, the last caveat I'll put into this too, because it does matter. That out, which I think would be a big component of taking a swing on a guy like Devante Adams, it will incur. That's a 3-year deal at $67 million with $15.7 in dead cap. If you want to get out after the 2024 season, I like getting out potentially after he's 32 and saying thanks so much for the effort. We see what the production was. We're not going to pay you $44 million, obviously. You have to be accounting for that as well, knowing there's going to be some dead money you'd have to incur.
Yeah, I mean, one last thing I will say, and
Okay.
maybe potentially it could possibly be the last thing we talk about, Adam. At the end of the day, my friend, the one other thing that I worry about also when we think about these big trades is where the Giants are cap wise and flexibility wise.
Yeah.
They don't have the money, so they have to make those moves. And we discussed it a little bit, but Leonard, in order to move Leonard Williams' money, you have to extend him, which means you have to add on more years for Leonard Williams and hope that he's going to be in a good spot. So, being able to absorb a $15, $20 million cap hit of one of these big time players means it's going to have serious ramifications on how this roster is going to be constructed, not from just the draft capital you're giving up, but all the other dominoes that have to fall to be able to fit these players underneath the cap. It would mean that the Giants would be making a significant shift from like building and continuing to develop to kind of flipping the light switch on and saying, we are going for it now officially.
Yeah, and it's funny too, just to round it out on specifically Leonard Williams. Remember, let's talk about it as a post June 1, whether it's a trade or a cut. You'd be talking about eating another 14.2 in dead cap and then freeing up 18 million. So you can see how those numbers work in your favor. But even if you talk about a restructure, not an extension, now Leonard Williams doesn't need to have any appetite for that, but that would only free up potentially north of $8 million in terms of cap freedom, while not incurring any dead cap and just shifting the money around to bonuses and all that kind of good stuff that the NFL has built in to be able to make like money to absolutely mean nothing. But to your point, though, it's like it could take a lot of work to get to that place. And some of the things that would hold it back potentially would be saying, well, am I willing to think about letting go of Leonard Williams in a trade like this to help bolster the Raiders defense? You're still going to be dealing with this dead money in those trade scenarios as well. So it's a very complicated thing to do. I will just say, when Devante Adams' name gets brought up as being someone that could be on the move, it has to perk up your ears. It has to just get you dreaming on what that could look like potentially, especially inside of this division that we know is going to be highly competitive in the upcoming year. Friends, you can find us on YouTube and you can get us on the podcast feed as we ramp ourselves up here heading into the summer. Very excited to dive in on all things New York football. Giants, we covered a big spectrum here, Andy. Hopefully everybody enjoyed it. But until next time, as Andy Mackowitz would want, need, and nay, demand you the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.